Let me begin this morning by acknowledging that these reflections are made particularly with those in position of privilege and power in mind, especially other white folk. I grew up here in Southwest Missouri, in a city with a checkered past and an uneasy present with regard to race relations, in a religious denomination that was explicitly founded on the defense of race-based slavery, and among extended family members who often exhibited prejudice. Race became one of those things that you could joke about, but you could never, ever talk about. And racism was certainly not an issue that you brought up with others, especially not at a family picnic, which was a lesson I never seemed to learn. So I grew up surrounded both by white people and by a brand of racism that was rarely named, but it was always implied. It was in the jokes that a family told at our gatherings. It was in the discussion around the sections of town that people said you were supposed to avoid. It was in the ways that our lives failed to include any people of color unless the coach was looking for folks to recruit for the sports teams. As a child, I had these two different worlds because I lived in that one, but then my parents raised me to believe in equality and inclusion of all people. And I saw on television these entirely different worlds. What was normal on 3-2-1 Contact and Sesame Street were these vibrant multiracial communities. So that was also my world. And I began to notice these contradictions as I grew up. I noticed how conversations about poverty portrayed low-income white people as down on their luck, right? But they would talk about Black, Indigenous, and people of color who were low income as leeches, who were taking advantage of a system. At school, I learned just enough about abolitionism and the civil rights movement to know whose side I was on, but I never, ever had an opportunity to study history or the arts from a multicultural, let alone from a critical social theory perspective. And I was ignorant about how complicit I was as a white person in these systems of oppression. As a result, as a young adult, I found myself opposed to racism, but without the tools that I needed to recognize and uproot it in myself or in the structures and cultures of society around me. Embarrassingly, it wasn't until I was in graduate school in the late 1990s that I began to better understand and finally start to undo these subtle layers of racist ideas and anxieties that were within and around me. And as I mentioned, I was embarrassed about it at first, until I had to realize then too that the embarrassment was part of the problem. It was shifting the focus off of racial justice and onto my own too often fragile identity. I didn't want to be the bad guy, right? Slowly, too slowly, I came to realize that understanding and dismantling white supremacy is absolutely essential in our continuing struggle for collective liberation for all of us. All of us. That it took so long for me to access that kind of learning, and that there were no people in my life growing up that both knew it and were willing to share it with me, that should be shocking, right? Should be really shocking. But it isn't shocking, is it? Because this kind of ignorance is part of the plan, always has been. It's no secret that racism has been an extremely effective tactic to thwart movements for democracy and justice in the United States. It creates a gulf between people who would otherwise be allies. And while the history of white supremacy is not simple, it's true that, as Bill Bigelow at the Zen Education Project has put it, the social elites of early America sought to manufacture racial divisions. Men of property and privilege were in the minority, and they needed mechanisms to divide people who, in concert, might threaten that status quo. Individuals' different skin colors were not sufficient to keep these people apart if they came to see their interests in common, end quote. And that tactic has been useful time and time again, and has resulted in a continued and accelerated redistribution of wealth and power toward the top percent of our society. And it always comes at the expense and well-being of most of us, and especially for those at the margins. Our history as the United States of America, and our economic power is built on the bones and the intergenerational trauma of enslaved Africans, displaced Native Americans, and exploited immigrants. And yet, the majority of white people have at best remained oblivious to both history and the continued impacts of systemic racism, even while we carry within us and pass on the trauma of white supremacy. And that has empowered those who have power across all of U.S. history. And this is so crucial, I think. This didn't just start with the Trump administration, right? This is our history. And it's empowered those empowered to continue on a course of exploiting, I don't know any other word for it, but the weakness of us white folk to cling to a view of the world that's not grounded at all in reality. That is, it's not grounded at all in the lived experiences of marginalized and oppressed people, especially Black, Indigenous people of color. Take, for instance, the different perspectives between Black and white Americans. Michael Dawson, who's a political scientist at the college at the University of Chicago and founding director of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, has studied and written extensively on the gulf, this enduring gulf that exists in our society. In a 2012 interview, Dawson was asked to comment on why it was that 90% of Black respondents, but only 38% of white respondents, understood the Hurricane Katrina disaster, the relief going to Hurricane Katrina, to reflect racial inequality. And this is what he said. He said, when I wrote these numbers into statistical equations, class disappears, region disappears, age and gender disappear, and the only thing that remains statistically significant is race. Controlling for all the things that sociologists, economists, and political scientists say you should control for, we find that what drives one's views most significantly is race. Dawson went on to describe what he called fundamentally different ways people were viewing the world. He said, for example, a large majority of white people thought as early as 2000 that Black people had already achieved racial equality, while 80% of Black people reported that they did not even expect to see racial equality in their lifetime or maybe never in the United States. Similarly, a survey in the mid-1990s showed that the majority of whites said that Black people had caught up in housing, healthcare, health outcomes, and unemployment, while the data demonstrated that the opposite was actually true. And a study by the Harvard sociologist Larry Bobo discovered that a small majority of white people thought that Black people were inferior, and a larger majority saying Black people were prone to crime and welfare. That's what's built into our culture. Dawson went on to say, so on the one hand, you have the view that Black people had caught up or are doing better than white people overall. And on the other hand, there's a feeling that Black people are whining. And all this while, Black people are saying that we're behind and we have a lot of catching up to do, that this society still sorts by race. You couldn't have two more firmly different ways of viewing the world. This has been being said for decades. And yet, maybe recently with the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter and the Native Lives Matter and the No DAPL movement, maybe we've begun to listen. But we have done a horrible job, speaking as white folks, at listening to what the reality of the world is. And most of the white people I've known that hold these kinds of views, they would insist that it has nothing to do with prejudice or racism, right? This is probably true for you too. In fact, they're convinced that they're actually standing up for what's right. This is what is told to me anyway, because they believe that white people are now the ones who are facing discrimination. In October 2017, just 2 years ago, NPR, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health released the results of a poll that surveyed 3,453 adults. And more than half of the whites, 55% surveyed, said that generally speaking, they believe there is discrimination against white people in America today. 55%. In the words of one of the respondents, if you apply for a job, they seem to give the Blacks the first crack at it. And basically, if you want any help from the government, if you're white, you don't get it. If you're Black, you get it. Just so there's no confusion, I'm going to say it plainly. All of that is wrong. Like, 100% wrong. Plenty of bad things happen to people who happen to be white. But that is not the same thing as a systemic oppression that is experienced by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Unfortunately, systemic racism is alive and well, and white people are still demonstrably receiving advantages in the spheres of wealth, education, political power, and the criminal justice system. So, no, white people are not being oppressed. So why is it so difficult for us white folk to understand that? One of the important dynamics behind this defensiveness is what Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term and described the dynamics of intersectionality back in 1989, has called backlash politics. I often talk about social norms and their importance in working for social change, and if I'm understanding Crenshaw correctly, she talks about baselines in a similar way. A baseline is a basic standard through which a person experiences and interprets the world. In this case, equality. And what we've seen in the United States is a collection of sociocultural movements that have trained people, especially white folk, to believe that American society has been a shining example of equality and justice, both historically and presently. As Crenshaw explains, quoting, "If your baseline is the status quo, if that is fair and just, you're going to think that diversity and affirmative action and actions that are meant to address inequality are preferential and problematic." And that's the reason why you can find people who are in positions of relative privilege and power who sincerely believe they're being wronged, that they are victims of injustice, and that they're standing up for equality when they oppose movements that, from a justice-minded point of view, are obviously good for our society and for all of us. Crenshaw explains again, quoting, "The narratives we see suggest that even the softest, the least confrontational, the mostly symbolic efforts to address our continuing dimensions of our past have instead amounted to an assault on the dominant race and gender group in the country, those who are straight, cisgender, white, and male, who purportedly represent what they call the new pariah class." This is a ridiculous and terrible dilemma, because the result is that you have people, especially straight, cisgender, white men, who are objectively in positions of relative privilege and power, but they feel powerless. Speaking especially to other folks who experience white privilege, our society has trained us to believe that the status quo is just and equal, and that all this privilege, all the white privilege, is earned, right? Rather than being the result of oppression and exploitation. And so when we encounter a movement that aims for justice to address and rectify those historic wrongs, instead, it's easily experienced as a threat. It's threatening the status quo. And if the status quo is good, then you're threatening what is good. You can experience it as, paradoxically, an attack on equality. An obvious step in getting free from this is to change that baseline. We need, if I dare to use it, a biblical word, we need to repent. There's a lot that needs to go into this, but my modest goal this morning is just to stress the importance of changing the baseline, of shifting our social norms when it comes to racial justice. Our baseline cannot be the status quo. If our baseline is the way things are or the way things have been, there will always be a reason to be defensive. We cannot cling to a system that is literally built on systemic oppression and simply add some equality on top and say that's good enough. Instead, we have to work from the insight of solidarity, the conviction that our well-being and freedom are linked. In the words we read for the wisdom lesson, Chris Krass put it this way: "My work isn't primarily to convince white people that they have white privilege. My work is to awaken the hearts and minds of white people to the reality that white supremacy devours our humanity and turns us into monsters against communities of color, and that racial justice is key to all of us getting free." That is the baseline that we can carry forward, that white supremacy devours our humanity, that it turns us into people who are complicit in and sometimes actively support things that we would never have dreamt of supporting in any other context. That honesty is essential because the reality is that it's likely impossible for a white person in the United States to not benefit from white supremacy in at least some ways. That I don't like it, that I'm trying my best to try to dismantle it, it doesn't make it any less true. Feeling bad about it doesn't help to change it either. And thinking that I'm the one who can make it all better just falls into the white savior trap. Our justice movements are not in need of saviors. They are in need of learners and partners. We move forward with the insight that, as Fannie Lou Hamer famously put it, nobody's free until everybody's free. But what does that mean in our everyday lives? One of the most basic steps that we, especially white folks, should be engaging in if we're serious about moving from white supremacy to collective liberation is taking our lead from and supporting racial justice movements that are led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color with our time, with our money, and with our efforts. So let's take a glance at one issue that often gets a lot of argument: reparations. At the heart of reparations is the commitment to repair harm, and this can be seen in the Movement for Black Lives' introduction to their policy positions on this issue. They write, "We demand reparations for past and continuing harms. The government, responsible corporations, and other institutions that have profited off the harm they have inflicted on Black people, from colonialism to slavery through food and housing, redlining, mass incarceration, and surveillance, must repair the harm done." That's straightforward, right? And you would think it could elicit widespread support. After all, isn't making things right after you've hurt someone one of the cornerstones of society, right? This is how we live together. If you hurt someone, you make it right. Unfortunately, it's not the case. The most recent poll from September 2019, just last month, by the Associated Press and the NORC Center for Public Affairs Research, asked this question. They said, "Do you think the US federal government should or should not pay reparations for slavery and racial discrimination in this country by making cash payments to the descendants of enslaved people?" 74% of Black respondents said yes. 44% of Hispanic respondents said yes. Only 15% of white respondents said yes. For that matter, if you look up here, you see that only 35% of white respondents believe the government should officially apologize for the history of slavery in this country. That is a pretty astounding refusal, isn't it? That doesn't cost anything, even. But if we frame this graph right here in terms of Crenshaw's backlash politics, I think we can get a better idea of what's going on. If you're convinced that the status quo is just, there is nothing to apologize for. If you're convinced that the playing field is already level, then reparations would only give the recipients an unfair advantage. As one white respondent put it to this survey question, "None of the Black people in America today are under the slavery issue. It's over with. Paying reparations would be unfair to me. My ancestors came to this country, worked hard to become Americans, and never asked for anything." I mean, that can't be true, but that's what they said. So if that's the kind of baseline that's out there, it's no surprise that 85% of white respondents oppose reparations. So what if we changed the baseline? What would happen if we actually listened for a change and listened to the leaders of movements working for racial justice? Let's return to the Movement for Black Lives platform. The actual policies they demand for reparations are that all Black people will have access to, number one, universal free education. Number two, a guaranteed minimum livable income. Number three, reparations focused on healing ongoing physical and mental trauma and ensuring our access and control of food sources, housing, and land. Number four, education and school curriculum and public monuments that preserve and honor Black history, including the ongoing struggle against racism. And number five, passage of House Resolution 40, the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. This is a very practical example of a policy for reparations, and the full platform goes into a lot of detail into what's involved in accomplishing these goals. And I encourage you to read the entire platform of the Movement for Black Lives. I, for one, am happily and enthusiastically on board with all of that, and I think you may have heard us speak about those things more than once here. Education, a basic income and/or guaranteed employment and a truly living wage, health care for all, secure food and housing for everyone, inclusive education, and a willingness to honestly engage with mistakes. All of those should be basic human rights. All of those should be our basic expressions of human decency. None of that should be controversial. Our task in this moment of history is to work together so that all of that, instead of being controversial, is just normal. That becomes the expectation, that this becomes the minimum level of human decency, and it becomes an essential step in our ongoing commitment to create a society that is truly healthy, compassionate, equal, and just. I know if it were easy, we would have already accomplished it. I know that we have a lot of hard work to do, building on the hard work that's already been done. Bell Hooks has helpfully named the system we've inherited, all of us, imperialist, capitalist, white supremacist patriarchy. And that system exploits racial and other divides in order to perpetuate terrible injustice that make life worse for everyone but the very few. The system was designed to profit from oppression and exploitation, but it requires us. It requires our complicity, the complicity of the masses, to maintain its power. The powers that be are counting on our willingness to accept our own level of oppression in exchange for certain privileges and conveniences, and at the cost of the suffering of others. But they're counting on us to be comfortable with the suffering of others so that we can have our conveniences. We can say no to that baseline. We can say yes to a new baseline, to the way things could be. We can say yes to making the changes in our lives, communities, and government policies that finally embody solidarity, justice, equality, and love. And may I just say, any discomfort that we may feel, especially as white folk, any risks that we take to oppose and replace that old baseline, that's nothing compared to the suffering we have been content to allow Black, Indigenous, and people of color absorb for centuries. We need to act out of commitment to the freedom, well-being, and joy that awaits us all when we live in truly just and equitable communities. It is our anger and our grief at the terrors of racial injustice. It is our growing love for one another as interdependent members of the human community, and it is our shared vision for another way that will see us through. That's the baseline, because nobody's free until everybody's free. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.